First of all, let me say, you can be seated. First of all, let me say, I'm so happy that you all survived the storm of this century. Listen, I didn't grow up, but I spent 9 years. I always say I did 9 years in the Northwest because it felt like time because it rains all the time. And in the Northwest, we called that a Thursday, a Friday, a Saturday. It was just normal to be in a storm. So it was interesting to watch all the people go buying water, and I was just laughing. I was like, it's just going to rain. Now, north of us, some people got hit pretty hard, and we need to pray for them where there's been flooding. But guys, it's called rain. It's called rain. Hey, we have a special treat this morning. As you know, we are a Foursquare church, and some of you might not know what that is. It's a denomination of thousands of churches worldwide, and so we are part of a bigger family than just right here. And there's stuff going on all around the world. The gospel's being preached, missionaries being sent, and we actually, part of our gift to our organization is that we actually give money and fund missions and things around the world. And so we really are part of a bigger story than just in Danville. And our president of our denomination is with us this morning, and he's going to preach. And I've known Glenn for probably maybe more than 20 years. When I was a district youth director, he was a supervisor of one of the districts. And we actually were in a meeting one time, and I'm going to tell this story. I guarantee you forgot this. But we were in an executive council meeting in Virginia Beach at the 700 Club place. And so I'm young and dumber than now. And I'm sitting at the table, and Glenn, we're talking about an issue that we want to ask questions about in this meeting. And so we brought up this one kind of sensitive thing, and Glenn looked at me and goes, Rick, get on the mic and ask him. And I was like, oh, okay. I didn't know that I was actually putting myself in harm's way. And so when I sat back down, I said, thanks, Glenn. Thanks for doing that to me. But he is a great man of God, and he is literally taking our denomination through some very needed changes, because if you look, denominations start out with a vision and a passion from God. It's not like they decide we're going to start a denomination. It's a move of God, and as that move of God grows, it becomes life-giving. And then if you watch most denominations, they literally hit a peak, and then they'll start on a 100-year decline until they're just not very powerful. And I know, because I've talked to Glenn and others that have been in meetings, that we have made hard decisions over this last year for our denomination. And so I believe our denomination has the chance to really have that impact again, like back in Amy Simple McPherson's day, and what God is doing. So I'm saying that. You don't need to applaud yet. We'll applaud later. Glenn is a man that hears God and listens to his peers and gets counsel. And I believe in where we're going as a denomination, that there really is life for us and a future in Jesus. So Dr. Glenn is going to come and share the word with us. Would you please welcome Glenn Burris?
Rick promised not to give away any golf scores yesterday. I have a philosophy about golf. If I play with someone, they shoot in the 90s, they're neglecting their game. They shoot in the 70s, they're neglecting their ministry. I won't reveal what I think about Rick in terms of his golf game, but he and I have been have had fun hanging around together for a number of years, and so love him and Cindy, and grateful for their leadership here. So thank you, Cindy. And Ron and Susan, our friendship goes way back, and your investment here in Danville in the church, you and I both know what it's like to pastor a church and then leave it and be able to come back and celebrate God's continued investment in people's lives and the impact that this church has had and continues to have on the community. So I want to celebrate with you today at East Bay. When I saw the kids up here this morning, I just wanted to go. There's a little girl up here in red, and I just wanted to come up and just give her a big hug, because in the entire worship time, she never let her hands down. She was always worshiping the entire time, and I just thought, what an amazing model and example to all of us. Well, I'm going to talk about mercy today, and I have a personal example of mercy this morning. I was coming to church. I was running a little bit behind, and I was pushing my luck on the interstate, and one of our faithful California State Highway patrolmen was sitting on the side of the road with a radar gun, And as I go by, passing all the other cars, his radar gun is pointed right at me. And as I pass by him, I do what all of you do when you pass by a state patrolman. You look in your rearview mirror to see if the lights come on or if he pulls out. He did neither. And that, my folks, is mercy. I just wanted to give you a current example of mercy that I experienced. You know, God, it is the essence of God's character. David caught it early when he said, "Thy loving kindness or thy mercy is better than life." In fact, David said, let me paraphrase, "I would rather conclude this life than live without your mercy." That's how valuable living under the umbrella of God's mercy is. And we encounter things all the time where we get to represent God's mercy or we get to represent our particular view of life and things. And, you know, I'm a little bit of a Facebook fanatic. I think social media can be a great tool, and it can be a great challenge as well. And I watch the Christian community at times and how it stewards its voice in social media. And I wonder sometimes, as the world is not made up its mind about Christ, and it looks at our testimony, I wonder at times what they think, how they view our heart, and does it match the heart of God? And what do we do when we find ourselves in challenging situations? I was telling first service that I was on an elevator in Dallas, Texas at our national convention last May with all of our pastors. And I got on the first floor, and there were some conventioneers on it, a bunch of pastors, and there were 3 young people in their 20s, and they had just come from happy hour. And they were pretty happy. And they still had their happy cups with them. And so they were loud and laughing, and everybody just kind of looked at each other on the elevator. And but by the 10th floor, everybody had departed the elevator except me and them. So as the elevator closed, they turned to me and they said, "So what are you doing in Dallas?" And I said, "Well, I'm here with some friends from all around the world." They said, "That's fine. That's great. We just came in from El Paso for the weekend, and we're having a good time. And so what do your friends do?" Now, the elevator's moving at this point, right? It's going up. And I said, "Well, we're here for a pastor's conference." And, "Well, what kind of pastor's conference it is?" And about the time I said it's a Foursquare pastor's conference, the door opens. It was my floor. My assistant is standing in the hallway ready to take me to an appointment. And these 3 kids, almost at the same time, said, "You can't leave us now. We don't know what Foursquare is." So I looked at my assistant, I looked back at them, I stepped back in the elevator, the doors closed, and I went up to their floor, stepped out, and for an hour had a chance to talk to them about the church and about the Foursquare Church. Now, I don't know if they remember anything I said the next day. I really don't. But I do know that that was a divine encounter. And I wonder how many of us look at the routine things that we go through and what oftentimes have originated as earthly assignments, but there's a secondary nature to what God's trying to accomplish, which is a divine assignment. Let me give you an example. Young shepherd boy David is sent by his father to deliver goods to his brothers on the front line of war and bring back a report on how his brothers are doing. The father is obviously anxious because he's not getting any feedback from the front line. David shows up, and instead of being there to actually deliver the goods and bring back a report, God has sent him there to deliver Israel from Goliath. And I wonder how many times we understand that some of even our most, what seems to be routine assignments in life are literally leveraged by God as a divine assignment to interrupt something the enemy has planned and to bring about his plan. And that's what I consider today to be my message to you, because I'm commissioning you today. You may not have a license. You may say, "Well, I look in Ephesians and it said these gifts are given to the church, pastors, apostles, the prophets, pastors, teachers, and I'm none of those." Great. But God's called all of us to be devoted disciples of His, and part of that is that we're called to be agents of mercy. fact, Jesus, in one of his first sermons, in fact, they say it was his first sermon, Sermon on the Mount, delivers this compelling message to people who are listening. I mean, isn't this Mary's son? Isn't this the son of a carpenter? Didn't he grow up in Nazareth? Wasn't he born in Bethlehem? And he's delivering this compelling word. And instead of talking about building a system, instead of talking about building an infrastructure, what he talks about is the way people think about life and how people are going to be viewed in the kingdom of God. And he uses this one phrase, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy." It shouldn't have been strange language for them, because the minor prophet Micah would have said to all of Israel, these three things God requires of you: that you do justly, and you love mercy, and you walk humbly before God. I love the fact that he frames mercy in not that you do mercy, but that you love mercy. It's just not an action on your part, though it is action, but it's something that, if it's truly to be merciful, it arises from the heart. It boils down to you seeing a situation and believing that you have been called to be a part of that person's deliverance, to be a part of rescuing that person, to be a part of changing the scenario, somehow of adding your weight, your voice, your story, your authority, your encouragement. And all of a sudden, the scenario changes. It's different than where a person may have been headed down this direction. Now, when it adds your part, his life radically is changed. I was in Kenya, and I was on a safari, and our guides had taken us in a Jeep to watch these 11 lions eating the carcass of an elephant. And I was pretty amazed at the scene. And to all of our surprise, over the hill from the left came a Cape water buffalo by itself around the corner. He couldn't see the lions as he come up over the hill. They couldn't see him, but by the time he got around the corner, they could both see each other. He startled them. They all stood up and took off after this water buffalo. I'm thinking to myself, this is dessert. This is how life works in the wild. So they all disappeared over the hill, and to my amazement, in about 25 seconds, those 11 lions came running back over the hill, chased by 300 water Cape buffaloes. My perspective was changed. And I wonder if at times life doesn't isolate people. And in their journey, for whatever reason, the injustices and the pain and the journey of life all of a sudden injures people or puts them in a very vulnerable spot. And frankly, their life would be consumed. Their marriage or their ministry or their future would have no hope to it. Paul said at one time, be ready to give a reason for the hope that is in you. That all of a sudden someone that you encounter that is hopeless for some reason, maybe it's their life's journey, maybe it's their own life's decisions, however they got there. Sometimes we're an innocent bystander. Sometimes we've actually been the recipient of their actions and called by God to still be their deliverer. I love the story of Joseph, who's betrayed and sold into slavery by his own family. And isn't it odd that God would choose him to deliver them? In fact, when their father died and all the brothers got together and said, now that our father's died, he's going to exact revenge on us because he's made it in life and we're in a strange country. And Joseph said to them, no, settle down. God arranged all of this, took even the enemy's plans for my bad. Now, what's interesting is that Joseph has come to the point in his own life that he doesn't even blame them for where he's at. God even used your plans, which he doesn't sugarcoat and say that they were good plans, but that God took your plans and turned them for his good. And part of that was that he's used me to prepare the way for your future. Now, that is about as dramatic a change as you could get, to be the recipient of someone's intentional injustice, and yet God would use you to be their deliverer. I was at church camp at about age 13 or so, and probably experienced the worst bullying experience of my life. There was a guy who came to our camp. He was a former gang member. And they said he was saved. I would go on record as saying I think he was barely saved. Now, I don't know if there's a term for that, but I don't know. I didn't want to challenge the fact that he hadn't asked Jesus to forgive him of his sins, but boy, his actions were sure questionable. And he decided to pick on me, and he harassed me all week in front of my friends, and the final day, he chose to really embarrass me in front of them, and it was the worst bullying experience of my life. I'll never forget that. Well, a year ago, this has been almost 46 years. A year ago, I was preaching in Concord, North Carolina, and I looked out and he was sitting in the audience. Now, remember, this is 46 years. I hadn't seen him since I was 14, but I knew who he was. 46 years had not dulled my memory. After the service, he came up to me and he said, "Glenn, my name is," and I filled in the blanks. He said, "You remember me?" I said, "Oh yeah, I could never forget you." And he said, "You know, my life's really been a roller coaster, and I've had a lot of hard times, but my wife and I have stayed together. And in fact, we believe in this last season of our life, God's called me into the ministry. And we're applying for Foursquare credentials." I said, "Did anybody tell you that I was now the president of the Foursquare Church? And is there anything you'd like to say to me before you submit that application?" That's what I wanted to say. Instead, what I found myself saying to him is, "I'd like to see your story written out. And I'd like to know what God's done in your life. Because if what you're saying is true, I'd actually like to be the first one to sign your application." And I realized at that point that I was free. I was free at a point that literally I could have leveraged some authority, but instead wanted to be an instrument of God's mercy. David, who was harassed for 25 years of his adult life by an unrighteous king, refused to take justice into his own hands. "I will not raise my hand against God's anointed." In fact, after Saul dies, one of his first orders as the new king was, "Is there anybody still alive in the house of Saul?" And they find him a crippled boy. And David said, "You will sit at the king's table, and everything that belonged to Saul belongs to you." Now I think I know a little bit more why God said, "Consider David a man after my heart." You see, it doesn't really matter if in our life we replicate the miracles of God and miss the heart of God. Paul would say it like this in 1 Corinthians 13. He said, "What good does it do if you give your body to be burned, if you have the tongues of angels, if you could move mountains with your words, but it's not motivated by love?" Somehow in the midst of this, God is saying, I'm not sure that you quite understand the kingdom that I'm building. You may be building your own kingdom, and it may be something that you can measure, but the kingdom that I'm building isn't measured by observation. It's righteousness, peace, and joy in the Holy Spirit. It's an invisible kingdom. It affects the way men think. In fact, in the first century, when they identified Christians, they called them people of the way. Of what way? Of His way, of Jesus' way, the The one who said, go the extra mile, turn the other cheek. If they curse you, bless them. If they use you, pray for them. He didn't just say, invite your friends and family to dinner. He didn't even say, as the Middle Easterns would do, invite your strangers to dinner. No, this was a guy who came along and said, no, the kingdom of God means to invite your enemies to dinner. I don't just mean that you should forgive them. You are called to love them. The world doesn't expect that. In fact, no other major religion in the world operates on this principle. But the God we serve, who sent a son 2,000 years ago that we celebrate with lights and gifts and singing songs, is a God who came in the form of a baby to bring a message. He was only 33 when they nailed him to a cross because he told them to love their enemies. That wasn't something they were willing to work with. In fact, their religious system had developed such a callousness to it that the world wasn't even able to understand God through their traditions and the way they were following the law. And God realized that he had to institute something different because people weren't being drawn to him by rules and regulations. What would break the barrier? What would cause people to want to be redeemed, to be freed from the influence of a world system that exacts such injustice and discovers after a while that there is no end to exacting justice? At the end of the day, it doesn't solve your problems. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Sometimes we try to operate life by finishing life and operating according to the world systems, and we discover it has no permanent solutions. I was interested the other day, if you look at Leonardo da Vinci's painting of the Last Supper, something I'd never really thought about before, but if you look at it again, all of the disciples, he paints this picture, they're surprised in this picture. They have a sense of surprise. And Da Vinci was painting this moment where Jesus said to them, one of you will betray me. And they couldn't believe it. Is it me? Is it him? They didn't even know at that point it was Judas because Jesus so loved this man that would give him a kiss of betrayal. Then in the moments after that Garden of Gethsemane, Matthew said he was filled with remorse and ran back to the chief priest and threw the money on the floor and said, I have betrayed innocent blood. And here were the religious leaders of the day. Let me tell you what their response was. What is that to us? And they went about discussing how they would spend this betrayal money that they now had back. The callousness of a world that doesn't understand the broken heart of God for a world that lives in constant injury and pain. Now, through the message of the gospel, we have this one single story that I want to finish with today. It's a story that Jesus himself tells. Some say it's the most common parable ever told. He was asked by an attorney, what is the most important commandment of all? And Jesus said, to love God with all your heart, soul, body, and mind. But as Jesus normally would, he kind of broke outside the box and he said, and to love your neighbor as yourself. The attorney responded, so who is my neighbor? And then Jesus tells the story that we know today is the story of the Good Samaritan, about a man who was on his way from Jerusalem to Jericho and was accosted by thieves. And they beat the man up. They rob him, and then they strip him of his clothes. They humiliated him. He's laying there defenseless, almost at the point of death. A Levite and a priest see him, but pass by on the other side. It is, I know the verse you will read often every time you read this story, but I can't pass it without stopping for a second. They saw him and passed by on the other side. A Samaritan, Jesus said, saw him, had compassion on him, went to him and bound his wounds, put him on his donkey and took him to an inn and cared for him all night, and paid for his care and said to the innkeeper, if there's any other charge when I return, I will cover it. Jesus finishes the story, and the attorney says, so then who is or Jesus then asked the question to the attorney, so who was neighbor to the man injured? And it was the attorney who replied, the one who had mercy on him. Wow. All of a sudden you get this sense that Jesus is painting a picture to a calloused religious organization that had missed the point. They didn't understand the why of the gospel. They understood the what of the gospel. You go to the temple, you go to the synagogue, you read the scrolls of Isaiah, you follow all the traditions, you keep all the rules, but somehow their heart was not aligned with God. And Jesus knew that, and so he began a different movement. It was, if you want to call it, a revolution of sorts. It wasn't a revolution with guns. Wasn't even a revolution in a sense of protest, but it was a revolution. It was a revolution to a way to do life that had mercy at the forefront. When I look at this story, there's some things that jump out at me about mercy, and I just want to share these with you. Mercy means getting your hands dirty. Mercy isn't an emotion. It isn't just feeling for someone. It means getting your hands dirty. It means getting involved. Mercy means extending help to people regardless of whether they deserve it. It's not based on merit. Mercy is not based on whether people deserve it. Mercy is based on the fact that you have received mercy. You are living apart from a judgment that you so deserve. Mercy means that your schedule is flexible. Sometimes we miss great divine opportunities because we have our own schedule and we're not discerning that God has got something totally different in mind. Mercy means you're aware of others' needs around you. Mercy means setting aside your prejudices, your own pain, your own sense of judgment. In the Old Testament, when Jonah, the prophet who's supposed to prophesy, was told by God to go to Nineveh, can you imagine any pastor worth his salt being told to go to a community, go to the main convention center in town, preach a revival service, and everybody in town will not only come, they will get saved? And the evangelist says, no, they don't deserve it. So Jonah, instead of going to Nineveh, goes to Tarshish. And I love this story because God chases him. God pursues him, not to injure him. God pursues him to bring him back. How many of you know this, that you can run from God, but how many also know you can't run far from God? I mean, you can try to run from God, but you can't outrun him. God brings him back, and all of a sudden there's this storm, and he's tossed into the ocean. And I love the words that come from Jonah himself in the midst of all of this situation where God confronts him about his heart of judgment toward these people. Jonah says, if you're going to worship earthly idols, if something means more to you than God, then you will forfeit the grace that could be yours. You know, I realize as adults, we're grandparents. We have 3 wonderful grandchildren today, but I realized early on that I couldn't actually make my kids have me grandkids. I mean, I wanted them to have us grandkids. We asked them, they politely said no. We begged them, they politely said no. We threatened them, and they politely said no. So I realized as an adult I couldn't force them, so I just changed my will. I said the first grandchild gets everything, and I now have 3. So, you know, there's ways to motivate people. I love what Eugene Peterson writes in The Message, because if you go back and read what he writes about loving your enemies, it's so funny knowing his story out of the second grade, because in The Message is a compelling few verses about what it means to love your enemy. So I just encourage you to go read that. But when Eugene Peterson was in the second grade, he got beat up every day after school by a bully named Garrison Johns. Well, one day Eugene Peterson just had enough of it and decided to fight back. And he recounts in this story, he realized after he started fighting back that he was actually tougher than Garrison Johns, and he had him on the ground beating him up, and he was saying, "You need to accept Jesus Christ as your personal Savior." And he said no, so he kept hitting him till he finally said yes. And Eugene Peterson said, that was my first convert to Christianity. If I had to boil down this morning's message to a couple things, and then we're going to work toward a close. First of all, mercy is compassion in action. It's motivated by a heart that feels a sense of empathy for someone else's pain. But it's not an emotion alone. That compassion forces you to act. You must do something. You see somebody in a situation that you realize my involvement may alter their future. That's what mercy does. Mercy doesn't just sit back and feel sorry. Mercy engages in some kind of a response. Secondly, mercy will cost you something. Thirdly, mercy is altering someone's future. You know, in the Old Testament, you could see the heart of God. I mean, even though we have law and grace, even in the Old Testament, God said to the people of Israel, every 50 years we're going to call the year of Jubilee. Everybody's debt's going to be canceled. Everybody's in prison is going to be set free. Everybody that's a slave is going to be set free. And everybody who has had their property taken gets it back. Because what God says is, I know you. I know the way you treat one another. You'll put people in debt. You'll enslave them. You'll take their property. But even the law wouldn't change people's hearts. But when Jesus came, something happened. When Jesus came, there was some kind of shift to this message of hope, this message of forgiveness, that no matter what my past, I mean, you could have someone come to the altar this morning who's lived a life that if they wrote a book, you probably wouldn't find anything to criticize. You could have another person come to the altar who's made bad decision after bad decision and created so much pain. But to God, their past doesn't matter. He offers the same level of new start for everyone. No matter how much baggage somebody has brought, no matter how much shame they live in, no matter how much pain they've caused other people. Jim Cymbala, who pastors the Brooklyn Tabernacle Choir, tells this story after an Easter service. He had preached 5 services, and he said he was so exhausted. And he was sitting on the edge of the platform, and he said, I could smell the guy before he got to me. So I reached in my pocket to give him some money, and when he came up, I reached out with the money, and he said, Pastor, I don't want your money. He said, I don't even know if I'll survive on the streets tonight. But what I do need is to know more about the man you talked about today, because I think he's the only one who can change my life. What that man understood from the message was that another $20, another $40 wasn't going to change his life. But somebody opening up to him and introducing them to this man. It was that Thanksgiving and Christmas that this pastor, Jim Cymbala, invited this homeless man to have dinner with their family. By the first of the year, the man had given his heart to Jesus. By the end of the year, he'd enrolled in their discipleship program. And today, the man is an associate pastor at a church in New Jersey. Because somebody did more than hand him $20. They gave him their life. They intersected a man who was heading one direction, and all of a sudden God sent him in a different direction. There are people all around us. I mean, people who've been injured by life, people in our prisons, the homeless, the poor, the orphan, people in broken relationships, people that are the product of injustice. But mercy changes everything. Because mercy is not a duty. Mercy is a devotion to a belief that this is who we are. It's not what we do. Mercy is not based on whether people deserve it or not. I think if there is a 21st century evangelism model, it's mercy. In fact, I believe that mercy is spiritual warfare because the Word says that we can counter evil things by doing good. It's that Jesus went about everywhere doing good. Mercy means that someone's story has a chance to be rewritten. The final chapter of their life doesn't have to end with the way it's been. In fact, even our world celebrates mercy brokers. If you go to Yad Vashem today and walk in there, you'll see this huge memorial to Oskar Schindler. Why? Because the Jews honored a German who at the end of his life changed his story, became a person of mercy. William Wilberforce, 27 years in the British Parliament, finally in the last year of his life, got the Parliament to issue what began to be still a long process, but got the Parliament in Britain to outlaw slavery. Nelson Mandela, it's hard to imagine a guy who spends 27 years in prison inviting the very people who put him there to sit on the platform with him when he was inaugurated as the president. A person who decided a long time ago that mercy would drive his life, not justice and not judgment. Before I'm the president, before I'm a husband or a dad or a grandfather, I'm a follower of Jesus Christ. It's not about my public ministry, it's about the private one God gives me. It's about being a devoted follower of Christ. It's more than a sermon, it's a life message. Paul wrote this about God: I know a God who is rich in mercy. I tell two stories and we're done. Bart Millard, who is the lead singer of Mercy Me, wrote a song called I Can Only Imagine. He wrote this song because he was expressing his own devotion that he couldn't wait to get to heaven to see his father. His father died when he was a sophomore in college, and he said, despite the fact that some theologians think that people from heaven can see down what's going on earth, he said, I don't know. I just don't know that I have proof of that. And when my father died, he was very disappointed in me. I had not lived up to his expectations. He was an All-American football player at SMU. My brother was all-conference football player. I hurt my ankles in college and took up music, and he was not very happy. So I can't wait to get to heaven. This is what this song is about. I can't wait to get to heaven to tell him what kind of dad I became, what kind of husband I became, what kind of follower of Christ I became. I can only imagine, Bart would write. So somebody said to him, so how did you get the title Mercy Me for your group? He said, oh, that came from my grandma. He said, she never believed in what I was doing, and every time I'd come to her house, she would say, mercy me, Bart, when are you going to go get a real job? So despite the fact that he had no support from anybody in his family, Abraham Lincoln once said, I have always found that mercy bears richer fruits than justice. This opportunity we have. I was just in Japan after their tsunami. The area that got hit by the tsunami that affected their nuclear plant had not had a gospel witness in 500 years. 500 years ago, they wiped out Christianity in that part of Japan, and there's never been a Christian witness in 500 years. When I went, which was 6 or 7 months after the tsunami hit, there were 22 Christian ministries still operating in that area. And I met with some Japanese, and they said, Glenn, would you tell us something? I said, I'm not sure if I can help you. They said, a lot of people came in here after the tsunami, but they're all gone. Only the Christians have stayed. especially after what we done to you. I mean, there's a big memorial in that area that one of the popes visited where they massacred, I think it was 139 people who refused to recant their testimony to Christ. And that was the last evidence of Christianity. But here were people building houses, helping to restore the life of people they didn't know because of mercy. And I'm glad to report to you that about 2 months ago, I got a note that a new church is being started in that area. And a witness of Christ is being returned to an area that took 3 years to just lead with mercy. And now that area is opened up to Christianity. I want to finish with a slide presentation this morning. I was profoundly moved by this story when I saw it in, it was not a Christian publication, it was broadcast along ABC and CNN. This is about a year ago. The man in the middle with the blindfold was being led to his execution. He had killed another young man, had been convicted, and was being led to a public gallows. Next picture, please. It's not only very public, but there's a law in Iran that the family of the man killed can participate in the execution of the one convicted. So I want you to look at the next picture. There is the mother to the right of the man who was killed, standing in front of the man who's now on a chair. Generally, what happens is the family comes up and pulls the chair out from under the person. It's a very crude execution, but very effective. But instead of pulling the chair out, she asked for another chair. And she put the chair in front of his, slapped him, and said, "You're forgiven." Because in Iranian law, not only does the family of a convicted, not only is the family of the person who's the victim of a convicted person have the opportunity to participate in their execution, they're the only ones who can pardon them. So after she slaps him, he says, "You're forgiven." Next slide. This is the mother of the young man killed, and the father of the young man killed, removing the noose and his blindfold. Next picture. The mother of the man who was killed is being comforted by the woman whose son has just been given back to her. That's the results of mercy. Now, I don't know, because it did not say this in the story and I did not follow it up, but the underground church in Iran is growing faster than any church in the world except the underground church in China. They say that millions of people are coming to Christ in Iran. I know several Iranians who go in and out, and they confirm many of these stories. I can't prove this today, but what I choose to believe is that the essence of Christianity that's beginning to shape and change the fabric of that nation from its roots. I have been in China, and I've experienced an unbelievable movement of believers in a nation that calls itself atheists, which means they don't believe in God, and yet allow churches to be built everywhere. There's still lots of complications, but it's a story that's being written. Partly of the mercy gift of people who've been leading in ways that understand the heart of God, understand the sacrifice, understand this essence of Christianity. I want you to bow your head this morning as I close. I'm wondering if there's anyone here that would say, "You know, Glenn, I get it. I understand that God's called me to be an agent of mercy. And I'm not sure that's always been my heart. I've found at times my heart to be callous toward others, and yet I realize that ultimately judgment is in the hands of the Lord. I want to commit to the Lord of just being available to be an agent of mercy for Him. In every situation that I can insert something that alters someone's future and is motivated by a sense that I have been given mercy, now my assignment is to give mercy to others. If that's you this morning, if there's some sense that during this time this morning, God just spoke to you in a very private way to say, you know what, I want your heart to be more tender and more discerning of those around you, to be an agent of my mercy. You just raise your hand. I think in this season, God would motivate many of us. Lord, thank you for hundreds of hands this morning. Secondly, I wonder if there's anyone here as I close and Rick will come forward. There's anyone that says, you know, Glenn, I personally need mercy. There's things in my life that I just need to come back to the Lord and say, Lord, I need for you to cover me. Things that have brought condemnation or shame. In fact, I love it, the fact that this morning that we don't have to come cowering before the God who's been pursuing us all along. When Adam and Eve failed, God didn't wait for them to come. Though they were filled with fear and hid from Him, He pursued them. God pursues you this morning because He knows the effects of guilt and shame. He invites you this morning to come afresh and receive a new dispensation of His mercy. If that's you this morning, just say, God, I need for you to wash over my life with a fresh season of your mercy. Would you just, with heads bowed and eyes closed, would you just lift your hand? I'm going to pray for you this morning. Lord, I see the hands. I know, Lord, in this journey of life that we so desperately need to stay in touch with a God who is defined by being a God of love. So God, immerse us today in a new sense of your mercy and grace. Lord, remove the callousness of our heart so that we can be instruments of your mercy and bring redemption to so many people that are broken and need to be healed. In Jesus' name, amen and amen.
We always want mercy for ourselves, but we want justice for everybody else. Have you ever noticed that? We cry out for justice against that person, but we want mercy. Let's be the kind of people that give mercy. We're gonna stand up for just 5 minutes and worship the Lord before we leave this place, and let that message just sink into you. The train is rolling, and I got to warn you, it's very slow. So if you're going to take a ride, might be 30, 40 minutes before we see you again. So I'm just kidding. It won't be that long. But just the train's going. There's hot chocolate. There's hot cider. Hang out. Love on each other a little bit. Let's stand and let's worship the Lord.